Hey everyone, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. I hope you're having an amazing day wherever you are in the world, and thanks so much for joining me for another art video. Today, I'm going to be sharing a beginner's drawing class that I created for my Patreon community a while back. This one is perfect for anyone just getting started with drawing and sketching. It is full of super important foundational information that you should be aware of as a beginner if you're looking to move forward with your drawing. And I share a couple of exercises that you can follow along with so that we can actually put to use this information that I am sharing with you in a practical way, and everything makes much more sense. Now, a couple of things before jumping in. The first is I have made the two reference photos for this bottle that we're going to be drawing in our exercises available for you as downloadables via a link that I'll be leaving down below for you in the description box. These photos are completely free, and I would encourage you to go ahead and download them so that you can see them nice and large and practice with them. The second thing that I want to mention is I created this class a while back, and I talk about this awesome artist, Wayne Thiebaud, in the beginning of the class, which was still alive when I created the class. Unfortunately, he passed away in 2021. I was very sad when I heard about his passing because not only have I found his work very inspiring for many, many years, and I have huge respect for him because he never stopped creating art. He always continued working, and he also taught what he knew to others. But he is also an artist that I frequently brought up as an example when I've been teaching about 3D form and perspective for years with students. And you'll see why in just a bit. But anyway, I just wanted you to be aware of these two things. And without much further ado, let's jump into our class. I want to very quickly share some of Wayne Thiebaud's work with you. Wayne Thiebaud is an amazing American artist who I believe is about 99 years old right now. I love his work so much, and oftentimes whenever I get started with talking about visualizing the objects around us as simple three-dimensional forms such as triangular prisms, rectangular prisms, cylinders, cones, etc. with new students, I always like sharing his work with them because it's very visible and very obvious in his work. As I was mentioning before, absolutely everything around us, from a coffee table to an animal to a still life arrangement, everything can be visualized as a simple three-dimensional form or a combination of simple three-dimensional forms. And this ability to simplify and visualize whatever it is you're trying to draw or paint so that you can create an effective preliminary outline sketch before moving forward with either the drawing or the painting process is essential for us as artists. But in the beginning, we have to train ourselves to see. We have to train ourselves to simplify and to visualize and to deconstruct. And so I wanted to share Wayne Thiebaud's work with you before moving on to anything else, because in these pieces, in these beautiful paintings, you can gain a very clear idea of how those cakes are nothing but short cylinders. Those slices of cake and pie are nothing but triangular prisms seen at different perspectives. That coffee mug is nothing but a cylinder. And if we ever want to get to a point with our art in which we are describing or communicating a higher level of realism, then it's essential to understand the things around us as having volume and having a three-dimensional structure so that we can start understanding about perspective and proportion and shape so that that preliminary outline sketch shows all of these things effectively before moving on to anything else such as shading and texture and smaller details, because that base has to be structurally sound. No amount of shading or texture or detail is gonna fix a perspective that is off or is going to make up for lack of understanding of the object's planes. Alright, so having said all that, I'm going to take you guys through two different drawing exercises. I took two different photos at slightly different angles or from slightly different perspectives of this green bottle. In the first exercise, I'm going to take you through visualizing this bottle as a combination of simple, flat, two-dimensional shapes. And in the second exercise, I'm going to take you through visualizing this bottle as three-dimensional forms that have volume. So remember, when I say shape, I am referring to flat and two-dimensional. And when I say form, I am referring to an object that has volume and that has a three-dimensional structure. Shape and form are both elements of art. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started with the first drawing exercise. We're going to be using this photo that I am sharing with you on the left. And this photo, I made sure to take as much as flat profile view as possible. In the other photo that I took, you're able to see more of the inside of the bottle and you're able to see more of its actual three-dimensional structure because of the perspective that the photo was taken from. So for this first one, remember, we're visualizing this bottle as a combination of flat shapes. What do I mean with flat shapes? I mean rectangles, I mean trapezoids, triangles, squares, circles, that kind of thing. And just to be clear, no combination of shapes is right or wrong, because ultimately the purpose of creating or laying down these shapes is to be able to constantly compare the different shapes to each other in terms of width, height, distance, angles created upon each other, etc., so that we can arrive at effective overall proportions and alignment and placement within space. Why? Because our human brains are much more easily able to understand and compare and relate simple geometric shapes or forms when compared to a very complex irregular form. And this allows us to arrive at much better proportions, because remember that proportion is all about the relationships of the different parts to each other, the different parts making up a whole. And at the same time, we're able to much more easily understand straight horizontal or vertical lines when compared to more irregular lines that are angled in different ways. Oftentimes, when artists work on a drawing, especially if it's more of a complex subject and they start their drawing from left to right or vice versa, or from top to bottom or vice versa, all of a sudden they don't have enough space to fit in their subject on their drawing area, or it's not centered the way that they wanted it to be, or it's skewed, or the proportions are off. And by using this strategy, you're much more better able to use up your space effectively. And because you're actually seeing the thing in its entirety, right? Because you're working on proportions, which really forces you to look at the entire thing because you're comparing these things, these different elements to each other so that the whole looks correct. Those mistakes just don't happen anymore after you've gained a little bit of practice. So if you notice in this drawing process, the very first thing that I did was I laid down horizontal lines for myself, telling me where the top of the bottom is going to be and where the bottom of the bottle is going to be. This way, I'm sure that the entire bottle is going to fit in my drawing space. After that, I visually separated the base of the bottle from the neck of the bottle that gets more narrow at the top. If I had to simplify this bottle into two largest base shapes, it would be one larger one for the body of the bottle and one smaller one for the bottle neck. Remember, it's always very important to get started with largest and most general shapes and then make your way towards specifics. And this is why in the very beginning of this drawing process, one of the very first things that you saw me do was create a third horizontal line dividing out this base shape from the top part of the bottle. And for this, I visually measured out the height starting from the very top edge of the bottle to the base of the bottleneck. And I also measured out the base of the bottleneck to the very bottom edge of this bottle. I measured out these two distances so that I could compare them to each other and place that third horizontal line in a place that seemed appropriate. And once those two larger spaces had been divided out for me, I then started getting to work with separating these larger spaces into smaller shapes. And as you can see, I ended up with a combination of rectangles and trapezoids that are basically stacked on top of each other. And as I was mentioning before, all I did throughout this process was basically compare these rectangles and trapezoids to each other in terms of length, width, location, alignment, the angles created, etc. And things don't have to be 100% completely perfect by any means. The purpose of this practice is to develop your observational skills, your sense for visual measuring, so that you can then apply these skills to more complex drawings. We are drawing something completely freehand today. And to be able to do this, to be able to arrive at effective proportions and shapes via freehand drawing or sketching is a very complex thing that requires practice. And this is an amazing place to start. This is the kind of practice, along with other techniques and methods, that I often share in my innermost communities over on Patreon and even in my free Facebook group, that have allowed me to get to a point at which I'm able to draw pretty much anything I want completely freehand, including animals, including faces, landscapes, still lifes, pretty much anything that I want. And because I have that ability to break things down and to compare things along the way, I don't get overwhelmed with the detail in anything anymore, and I know exactly where to start my drawings. Okay, so by this point in the process, the base shapes have been laid down, and all I am doing is refining my shapes, refining those little angles, little curves, adding little details, etc. Many times at this point in the process, my angles are still very sharp, very geometric-like. And so this is the point in the process at which I curve things out. And in this case, because we have a tall object that has symmetry to it, I am just making sure that there is a symmetry from left to right halves. Everything looks pretty good to me at this point, and I don't want to forget to mention a little trick for you. Because this is a pretty tall object, meaning it has more length than width, sometimes plumb lines are very helpful. Plumb lines are basically vertical lines that a lot of artists use when they are drawing or painting even a face or a still life arrangement or anything like that, to make sure that things are in proper alignment or proper distance from each other. And as I was mentioning before, our brains understand straight vertical lines and straight horizontal lines a lot more easily than slanted, diagonal, angled lines and complex irregular shapes. And so oftentimes it's very, very helpful to lay down either vertical or horizontal lines for ourselves at any point of this drawing process, really, where you might feel it's helpful. Right here, I am going to lay down a few horizontal lines for you so that you can get an idea of how horizontals could also come in very handy, so that you can visually measure out the different parts of your bottle and arrive at effective proportions. These are just some examples of horizontal lines that could possibly help in this particular case. With these horizontal lines in place, you can more easily measure out the different heights of the different elements involved to make sure that you're arriving at similar proportions to what you're seeing in whatever kind of reference you're using. Okay, so right here I'm just going to finish up this quick sketch. And another thing that I don't want to forget to mention is I want to remind you guys that drawing is a refinement process, especially when we're drawing freehand, which I hope that you guys are interested in learning to do. We're really not expected to get everything right away. This is a refinement process, and we have to be able to erase along the way, refine shapes and all of that. And this is why I want to remind you to always get started with very light pencil strokes so you can easily erase mistakes and not damage your paper. After having added those final details and noticing that everything looks pretty good overall, this is the point of the process at which I would consider to start in with shading. Shading is not really something we're going to be talking about in this tutorial because this step is number one in my opinion. However, one tip if you do want to move forward with your shading and the development of different values, I would highly recommend always stemming from a great art reference photo that allows you to see highlights and midtones and darks so that you can properly recreate them. And if you're thinking of working on a more finalized piece like that, then I would recommend creating your preliminary outline sketch very lightly so that at the end, your line work created in this initial phase of the process is not visible. Because in realism, there are no outlines, there are edges. Outlines are used in stylized illustrations or cartoons, but when it comes to developing higher levels of realism, which is what I think you're probably wanting to do if you're starting to shade, then you really want to stay away from the look of outlines. All right, you guys, so let's move on with the second drawing tutorial. This time, we're drawing the exact same bottle at a slightly different angle or perspective, and we are going for three-dimensional forms. So before, we were using 2D shapes such as squares, rectangles, trapezoids, circles, triangles, etc. This time, we're creating our preliminary outline sketch using three-dimensional forms, such as cubes, rectangular prisms, cylinders, triangular prisms, anything of the sort. And if you notice, I got started in the exact same way that I started my first drawing by placing horizontal lines for myself, telling me where the very top edge of my bottle is going to be and where the bottom edge of my bottle is going to be so that I can make sure that everything fits within my drawing space. I create two vertical lines on either side of the bottle, which are going to help me keep everything aligned. And also because by having those vertical lines there on either side, I'm going to be much more easily able to replicate those very slight angles, those slanted lines on either side of the bottle. Because of the perspective that this photo was taken from, the sides of this bottle create two very slight diagonals going inwards. And by having those two straight vertical lines on either side, I'm going to be much better able to keep everything symmetrical. And then I do the exact same thing that I was doing before in terms of separating the two main parts of the bottle, which I would consider to be the actual larger part of its body and the bottle neck. Before getting started with my actual drawing, I want to just explain what's going on in my head right now. Whenever I see a bottle like this, automatically my brain simplifies it into two cylinders. A wider cylinder for the base body of the bottle and a more narrow cylinder along the neck, right? And then all it is I have to create two slanted lines where these two cylinders connect. Or another way that you could simplify this as is a large cylinder at the bottom with an inverted cone with the most open part pointed downwards and the pointy part at the top cut off. That could be another way to look at this. Again, whatever shape or form allows you to better visualize this structure as a three-dimensional form, and whatever kinds of forms allow you to better measure and compare different parts to each other, then that's perfectly fine. Now, of course, to do this, you would need some practice with drawing basic three-dimensional forms, such as all of the ones that I previously mentioned. And this is why I would say that it's important to start with the two-dimensional shapes first. Now, a little tip here is I see a lot of beginners starting out with drawing 3D forms such as rectangular prisms and cubes, practice their 3D forms only in one very specific angle or perspective, and then they hinder themselves because when it comes time to actually drawing a still life arrangement and the angle is slightly different, they have trouble with it because they haven't practiced drawing it and visualizing it at different angles. Okay, so right here you can see me start adding in that base cylinder for the body of the bottle. This is the largest form, so that's where I'm starting at. You can see how I am taking those very slight diagonals on either side of the bottle's body into account as I am laying down these lines very lightly. And because I have those two verticals alongside the bottle, I can much more easily replicate those angles that I am creating on either side of the bottle with those diagonals. Notice how I used the very first horizontal lines that I placed in the beginning of this process, the middle one and the one at the bottom, to give me an indication as to where to place that top plane and bottom plane of this cylinder. With that base cylinder in place, I then get to work on the bottle neck, which is another cylinder, only this time it's more narrow. And you're gonna notice how I first get started with drawing in a normal equal width from top to bottom cylinder. And then once that's placed in alignment with the base of the bottle, I then create those slight diagonals on either side. So remember that you can always go back and modify your 3D form as needed. That base 3D form that you lay down serves as a sort of guide in terms of proportion and location. And then once that's set, you go in and refine. You can alter and modify and even distort that 3D form as needed depending on what you're working on. With the bottleneck in place, I then connected the base of the bottle with the bottleneck with two slanted lines. Just like what I did with my first sketch, I am constantly observing my reference photo and taking note of the width of different sections of this bottle, their length, the distances between the different elements, the angles they create, the diagonals, etc. And I am constantly having that in my mind as I am laying down these lines and forms. If you're just getting started with drawing 3D forms and you're finding all of this very confusing or overwhelming, get started with flat two-dimensional shapes first and practice drawing basic three-dimensional forms such as all of the ones I previously mentioned in isolation and at different angles. Something that's also super helpful is practicing drawing your 3D forms in things like the 1-point perspective grid, the 2-point perspective grid, and even the 3-point perspective grid if you already gain a certain amount of experience and practice. Through practicing with these grids and gaining a better understanding of how perspective works and actually relating what you practice and learn with these techniques to real life situations, you're gonna much more easily be able to tell when the perspective looks off and what you have to do to fix it. Right here, I am showing you how I would draw a very basic coffee table from my imagination using a combination of simple rectangular prisms. And I can do this relatively easily because I have practiced breaking stuff down that I have in front of me, like simple pieces of furniture are great to practice with. So even if your goal as an artist is to be able to draw things purely from imagination in the future, if you want to draw these things with a certain level of realism, then it's essential to get started with actual real life references first. Whether these references are photographs or something that you have right in front of you that you're drawing from direct observation. I would recommend to anyone just getting started with drawing to focus on developing your observational skills alongside your fine motor skills and your ability to utilize drawing tools. Practice the strategies that I shared with you today, and alongside this, keep developing your knowledge of art fundamentals such as perspective, light behavior, three-dimensional form, and all of these things, because all of this permeates and really shows in every possible kind of artwork you may choose to work on in the future. And don't let any of this overwhelm you, because you can move through it a step at a time, and you're going to be improving your knowledge about art and your abilities greatly by taking it a step at a time. By taking time to cover these bases, these art fundamental topics, you're going to be light years ahead from the artists who look past them. Another final little thing I want to share with you today is, personally, I have always been terrible at math. I failed math when I was in high school a couple of times. And to the day, whenever I hear about numbers, my mind just gets blocked. So if that's what worries you, please don't let it stop you and don't let it keep you from practicing. Because if I can do it, I am sure that you can too. Okay, so with all of my base 3D forms set in place, I am now working on the final details. Hopefully you can tell how I am doing my best to keep my pencil line work very light so that I can make sure that I'm still able to erase anything that needs erasing before thinking of continuing with any sort of shading or going over any of my line work with more pressure. All right, so I'm almost done here, and hopefully you can see how this sketch looks a lot more 3D than the previous one. We can see the curves marking out and enhancing that cylindrical form. We can see into the bottle. And if I were to actually start developing my variety of different values, lights, midtones, and darks, I would really be able to enhance that sensation of three-dimensional form. And of course, if you're creating a realistic drawing, adding a sensation of cast shadow is also very, very important to situate the object in place and make everything look more realistic. All right, you guys, that is gonna do it for today's video. I really hope that you enjoyed it and that you found it helpful. And if you did, pretty please make sure to give this video a thumbs up because it really helps support the work that I am doing here on YouTube and helps others get to know about my channel. Thank you so much for watching today. Don't forget to subscribe and click on that little bell so that you can be notified of when I share my new videos, which happens every single week. Have a beautiful rest of the day and see you soon. Bye guys!